Now, today is International Data Privacy Day, and this is a day dedicated to global efforts that are aimed at empowering people to exercise their rights to privacy. And this year, the regulator will host a webinar on Monday, the 29th of January, focusing on misinformation, disinformation, as well as data protection during the election period. Let's now welcome Advocate Pansy Tlakula, the Chairperson of the Information Regulator, for more analysis. Advocate, thank you so much for your time this evening and welcome. Please take us through what the discussions on misinformation and disinformation as well as data protection during the elections will outline.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for having me. As you might be aware, this year alone, almost 50 countries globally are going to be holding elections. And what is preoccupying people throughout the world is the impact of disinformation and misinformation on the elections. You know that generative artificial intelligence does not help because if it is not used properly, it can also perpetuate misinformation and disinformation. As a viewer, you may think that you are watching a leader of a political party on social media, whereas what you'll be watching is his voice and his image being used through artificial intelligence to spread misinformation. So this concerns us greatly as the information regulator, because you know that we are custodians of the right of access to information and also the protection of personal information.
Now, South Africans continue to be inundated, Advocate, with unsolicited calls and direct marketing by means of electronic communication, despite the country's data privacy legislation or the Papaya Act. Why is this so, and how are you currently dealing with the multitudes of complaints in this regard?
We are actually about to release our very first enforcement notice on direct marketing through electronic communication. You see, as I have said before, that the problem that we have, or the challenge, is the definition of electronic communication in POPIA. And there is a view that marketing or direct marketing through a telephone call does not constitute marketing through electronic communication in terms of the Act. But that's a debate for another day. I would like us to focus on why we have chosen misinformation and disinformation for the theme of the International Data Protection Day. You see, the right of access to information is one of the cornerstones of democracy, because through access to information, you are able to exercise other rights, such as the right to vote. So that's one aspect. And we feel that, as the information regulator, that disinformation and misinformation violates the right of access to accurate, credible information. That's one part of it. Now, how does the misinformation and disinformation come into the picture? When there is disinformation, it usually uses images or a voice of a person and distorts it. And that image constitutes personal information of that person. So disinformation and misinformation may also violate the right to privacy of an individual as it relates to their personal information. So that's why we have chosen this theme for this year, particularly because 2024 is an election year in South Africa.
And speaking of right of access to information, Advocate, I mean, we know that social media is still largely unregulated and most of the content that is shared there is basically impossible to monitor. Are there any plans to look at ways that vital information, particularly around elections, is protected on these platforms?
Yes, tomorrow's webinar, we are doing it together with Media Monitoring Africa and the IEC, because the IEC and Media Monitoring Africa, they have a program to protect voters from misinformation and disinformation, and they are working closely with digital platforms. They will also be part of the webinar tomorrow. the digital platforms as well, because we can, the countering of misinformation and disinformation needs a collaborative process. We can't do it alone. The IEC can't do it alone. We have to bring the media on board. I was just thinking that the SABC has, for instance, a public education mandate, and I haven't heard the SABC, for instance, talking about the negative impact of disinformation and misinformation on the elections. And we all have the responsibility to educate the public about this very worrying phenomenon, which is a threat to democracy.
Absolutely. We'll certainly look into those scopes, Advocate. But in parting, what are the ramifications of such breaches, Advocate, as we know that some people even use aliases or parody accounts to peddle misinformation? Are you able to find and prosecute them? And what are the charges as well as possible sentences or even fines?
It is quite difficult, I must say, because sometimes you can't even trace the origin of misinformation and disinformation. I think the only remedy that we have is to ensure that we hold digital platforms accountable for this. We have to engage them seriously to see what processes are they putting in place to ensure that they don't carry misinformation and disinformation on their platforms. And in South Africa, we are fortunate because our PAIA, promotion of access to information, applies to both private and public bodies, and nothing prevents anyone from asking information from these digital platforms on measures that they are taking to deal with disinformation and misinformation on their platforms.
All right, Advocate, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.